Yeah, welcome to Kunsthalle Vienna. Welcome to l'Exposition Imaginaire. My guest this afternoon, Lolita Jablonskienė. You have such a... it's always difficult for me where to start with your biography when you really... We met already many years ago, at the time before Lithuania joined the European community and the time before, the euro, of course. And you were working in the very beginning, in the early 1990s, for the Soros Foundation. And a couple of days ago, when the Brexit happens, I don't know if you have heard about what Soros said about this. No? Oh, you said, okay, that will really, the Brexit will have a huge effect on all the Lithuanians living abroad.
Oh, he said that?
He said that because especially Lithuania, from that Baltic countries, one quarter of the population, Lithuanian population of altogether is about 4 million Lithuanians around the world.
I mean, there were 3.5 million Lithuanians living in Lithuania, but after the access to European Union, probably around 1 million of them emigrated looking for better paid jobs and generally opportunities for education and their careers to other European countries.
Yeah, and especially a lot of Lithuanians living and working in the UK.
Yes, there's a huge community in UK.
But he used it as an example, and I know we used to work at here in Kunsthalle Wien. We used to work together with a couple of Lithuanian artists, and recently with Augustas Serapina. It's a very young artist who has really this kind of double identity. He's just 25 or 26 years old, and the rest of his family, his brothers and his parents live in the UK. And what I learned, I come back to your biography later, but what I learned from him was he said, I'm in contact with my parents. I'm really grew up in the digital age of this country of Lithuania, and the contact with my parents is always virtual. And when Lithuania joined the European Union, and I visited Lithuania quite a lot. I was surprised how early this nation started to got digitalized in almost everywhere. Is that only my view, or is that true?
I mean. One has to be said about Lithuania, that Lithuania at the moment is one of the leaders in Europe and probably in the world for its fast internet. So whenever I come wherever, to Austria or be it wherever, everything seems to be very slow for me. Because indeed the internet connection is very fast in Lithuania. But what you started speaking about, shows that the problem of living in the digital is not, one phase. One thing is about communication, actually, using internet and other, digital meals, whatever they are, available on the internet as communication tools. And it's another thing to imagine, us living in the digital world or the digital world of images, which affects our imagination. Of course, communication, the fast communication also changes some premises for one's imagination, for travel, for accessing something, so on and so forth. But I would say that in Lithuania, this sort of practical aspect of, being in touch or communicating, being able to communicate goes first than the rest of the, results of digitalization.
What you see here in the back of us is the National Museum for
Well, this is the National Gallery of Art, which is the museum for modern and contemporary art in Lithuania. It does have this title, the National Gallery of Art, because it is a subdivision of the National Lithuanian Art Museum. But the fact is that if one imagines that national galleries come about the age of French Revolution, so I mean the nation state of Lithuania did not exist, in the 18th century, neither in the 19th century. So, and this gallery is actually quite a new venture. It was only opened in 2009, so it's 6 years old or 7 years old, and it started operating. I would say rather than the Museum for Modern and Contemporary Art, from the very beginning, than as a national gallery in its sort of traditionally understood sense.
But the building is from the 1980s, even it looks like a kind of a post-brutalist building, but it's not. On the right-hand side, it's the office building, which is a little bit disturbing when you are there. It really, in a way, it doesn't really fit to the...
that's because our condition is disturbing, the condition that we live in. So I suppose this actually fits.
No, of course, this is really, it's a computer-generated building, no? So otherwise it couldn't stand there like this. It's a national gallery. The Lolita is the chief curator, but you are responsible for both, as a general manager and coordinator for the policy and content coordinator. Or it's a bit producer, and your museum is part of a larger organization, all owned, and your policy. You're making state policy in a way. No?
Well, I hope that we participate in making of the state policy as well, because it's in constant making. If we speak about cultural policy, first of all, and, the policy at large somehow, as much as we can imagine that cultural, institutions and people who work in these institutions are generally heard on the political level.
Previously, you had so many different positions, mainly in Lithuania, but you curated a lot abroad. And when we met, I think you are one of the most known curators and directors of institutions from Lithuania who are known internationally. You curated twice the Venice Pavilion in 1999 and 2005. We gave your presentation, the talk today, as a subtitle, which is called Lolita Jablonskienė talks about strategies for the international reception of exhibitions that are geographically located on the periphery of Europe. It's a little bit provoking, so especially in the times of the digital present. Do you operate from the periphery?
I don't think we operate from the periphery. I think that we have a privilege of sometimes being left alone as periphery, if you wish. And here again comes, the issue of the museum in the age of, or the virtual museum, as is being discussed here. I actually think that it's not really the age of the virtual museum, it's rather the museum which lives in the virtual age. I don't think that there is something as a virtual museum. If we take, the notion of museum in its manifold meanings as it is. What is interesting in relation to the notion of periphery is that actually, I think, in the age of really proliferation of digital images on the web and the fast communication and everything, that we have started our talk with, it's not like everything evens up and that it becomes a horizontal, even field of images or of institutions or artists or curators, artistic production. I still think that not only the new hierarchies are created, but also the old hierarchies are strengthened. I can give you and the audience, probably a funny example. A few weeks ago, a museum of national Latvian art in our neighboring country, Latvia, reopened after its renovation. And on the occasion of the opening, the museum decided to let the audience for free, and it's mainly local audience that visits the museum, as is with us. We do not have floods of tourists coming to our countries yet. So I was passing the queue of almost 1 kilometer long, when coming to the museum. And what was interesting was to hear what people were expecting to see in that museum. So their expectations were as follows: do we see a Rembrandt when we get in?
Honestly,
yes.
Rembrandt.
Yes. Will we see a Picasso when we come in? And all various other expectations. So not to speak of the fact that these people probably have never been before to the museum, and they came only because it was a free entrance to that museum. The spread and proliferation of images on the web, on the internet, I mean, it actually gives birth to completely different expectations. I'm not judging that it is bad or it is good. I'm telling that there are actual hierarchies which are established in the wide field of the digital. I have here a funny slide which is probably too funny, but this is something which I Googled the day that I left on Lithuanian contemporary art. So this is, what opens as the first page, well, if somebody is looking for Lithuanian contemporary art. So I'm actually quite happy that the first slide above, this is the slide which shows the exhibition of Japanese contemporary art at the Contemporary Art Center of Vilnius. When the Contemporary Art Center of Vilnius is truly the institution that does work, with contemporary art. The last slide on the right to the viewers, I'm very happy. This is the slide of the project that we made, the National Art Gallery with a Lithuanian artist. But I don't want to point here, but there are at least 3 or 4 slides of the upcoming new private museum of modern art in Vilnius, which has been designed by Daniel Liebeskind. So this is what Google picks up most. And if I went to the second page, to the third page, the name of the architect, Daniel Liebeskind, would be more or less the opinion maker, if you want, for those who are following or trying to search on Lithuanian contemporary art. So there are these various hierarchies that the search engines themselves also introduce.
There is maybe, that leads me a little bit to my second question. There is this growing trend that everything what we do in art institutions and museums, around the world, that everything needs to be documented digitally, and it's put on the web, and sometimes without context. Maybe you should do it a little bit more, that you appear there at the first place if you want to see. You are the National Gallery. Yeah,
well, we do.
You do.
Well, we do. This is why I have this other slide. Lithuania, as other countries in European Union, benefits from general European funding, which is quite generously given to digitalization of various archives. So the Lithuanian Art Museum, where I work, because the National Gallery is part of it, has a separate big unit for digitalizing archives of libraries and museums. It's a very slow work, but it's going on, and I think it's going on slow also because nobody has thought till now, why do we do that?
Yeah, what is the purpose about?
Well, exactly. So an episode in your prepared film for Exposition de l'Imaginaire. I shows an interview with the guy who started the Google Museum project, was it? And he's happily announcing that the idea behind that was to give access to people, to all the treasures in the museum. So the question is really, why do we want to give that access? What for is this access? Because, is that sort of elite sharing, the knowledge and the treasures that, are kept in the museum with a wider audience? Is that for education? Is that for commercial use? Is that for whatever you can imagine on that? So before one actually answers the question, why do people need access to all these treasures? Well, it's different to figure out, what do you do with these archives, except that you are actually littering the electronic space. You are putting more and more and more image, into that. We discussed also with you this question, I think, about whether this actually makes things more visible or more invisible. I think I have mentioned, maybe even here in Vienna once, a remark by a Lithuanian culture theorist who was speaking about the very beginning of the 90s, trying to rethink of how various contemporary discourses in cultural theory, philosophy were coming in to Lithuania. And he used three metaphors. One was about the testing tube, when nothing could go in through the glass into the society that was closed in the Soviet Union. The other was of the sieve, something that you use for sieving flour, where only fragments of something would be coming in. And then the third stage was called the fog, which in my sort of understanding could actually be related to the cloud, as we speak about the digital, where things really become foggy. Things really become foggy, and these hierarchies that I mentioned do really matter. They do really matter. But what we do is what I show here on our website. We do, let's say,
it's a lot of text.
It's a lot of text, but there are images as well. Oh, luckily you cannot read it, so you concentrate then on these images. I actually take your remark about a lot of text quite seriously, because I think that certain objects that we are showing, be them paintings or we try to explain our narrative, it does need a textual guidance. It does need the textual guidance, because otherwise it's obscured by its coming from the periphery. People may just skip the text if they don't want, but I think they play here quite an important role in that sense.
But who uses your website? You said earlier that you don't host a lot of tourists. That means your museum is it's visited by locals.
Yes, the museum is much more visited by the local audience than it is visited by tourists, because there are no tourists, or there's a very small percentage of tourists. But I don't think this is in any case dramatic. I mean, in that case, we know our audience better than if we had to work with, dozens of thousands of people who actually just have the National Gallery on their route, because it is the National Gallery. They may not even care of what the National Gallery thinks it has a mission for, but they just pass through it because it's on their tourist route. So here we know our audience better, and we can actually discuss better the issues that are interesting for us with our audience. But we do have a website. At least, I would say, for our already established networks that we have. And Yes, abroad. As they can be very close networks. They can be, how should I put it, randomly originated networks because of the relations that different curators had, or institutions had historically, or in the most contemporary times. So for that, I think it is really important. I can tell you, as you mentioned, the Soros Center for Contemporary Art. Those who have ever visited those in the 1990s probably know that during the 1990s, Soros Centers for Contemporary Art developed quite comprehensive archives on the local art scenes, starting from, let's say, mid-century to contemporary art. And this happened at the time when at least some of Eastern European countries did not have the gallery scene. Well, Lithuania doesn't boast a very strong commercial gallery scene up to now. So there were no institutions that would be actually working with information on artists, producing artists, portfolios and making them available. So the National Gallery inherited the archive of the Soros Center for Contemporary Art, and we are still thinking how to work with that. I mean, we do not own rights on that.
But is the archive, is it already digitalized?
Yes.
Was it digitalized already in its time in the 1990s?
No, we digitalized that at the turn when we were kind of moving from Soros Center of Contemporary Art to the museum. We digitalized it at the end of the 90s. So the quality of the image is now not sufficient anymore. So we have something like, an archive, a digital archive of the transition period to a more higher quality, digital image. But it's not only about that. The point is that we don't own the rights for that, for the films, for the, any other kind of digitalized material, and we don't own the copyright, which is always an issue. I don't know how, for instance, MUMOC deals here with the copyrights of artists, which are modern and contemporary art. The copyright belongs to the artist still, and there might be long negotiations with the families, with the artists themselves about how you deal, with that image, even if you show it in low quality. I know that Tate Modern, for instance, also is complaining about the fact that it's much more difficult to work online with 20th century art than it is, to work with, the heritage from the 17th, 18th, 19th century. But I think it is an interesting challenge to work with archives that we have acquired during the Soros times and that the National Gallery now inherited. I'm just not so sure if making them public on the internet is the only way. I think that maybe this can be combined with some presentation in the physical structure as well.
Your audience is mainly made up, Lithuania is a very homogeneous country with not a lot of migration from abroad. And with this ever-increasing process of digitalizing everything, or take it for granted that you digitalize everything what you have done there, is it not the first step to, just to close that, shut that museum down, and have the National Gallery in the web? Lithuania is not a very, very wealthy country, and it's public money, it's extremely limited in this country.
But that depends hugely on how one sees the agency of the museum and its actual functions. Because, as I mentioned, the National Gallery actually opened in 2009 only. So we came to the stage of, operating as a museum very late. And it made no sense to start collecting things that were never collected in Lithuania, B, to continue building, let's say, the narrative of the national identity, because it was never started. There was never a National Gallery of Art operating before 2009. The Lithuanian Art Museum had an exhibition of 20th century Lithuanian art, including Soviet period during the Soviet times, but then it had a period of 19 years when these artworks were not on show at all. So when we came in, what was interesting for us was not only, working in the museum as a treasury of certain, valuable or, less valuable artworks, but immediately to try and think, what we could also do except from showing artworks in the exhibitions. So in that sense, we definitely, are not thinking about closing the museum, because people who are looking for what we have are probably few abroad, which I wouldn't say is any problem at all. Because there are people who are interested and they always find their ways, to the information. But then all the other functions of the museum, are definitely more important. Apart from that, I have chosen also here, a couple of slides where I wanted to show and speak about something which I called to myself, wanted to find a word for which would be opposite for dematerializing. Part of the thinking that we have and that we invest into exhibitions is about actually reconstructing, rematerializing certain things that were lost during the Soviet time. We do have to understand that Lithuania lived, for 50 years in the Soviet Union. So some of its important narratives, objects, artifacts have either been lost during the Soviet time
or afterwards,
especially in the beginning of the 1990s. So what I'm showing here is actually a result or a couple of examples from the workshop that we had with curators and architects about trying to figure out how we could show or present, rather, I don't know even which word would be better, the 60s architecture and designed objects. We were thinking about the exhibition on modernization and the local versions of modernization, during the Cold War period. And then we realized that the Museum of Architecture was closed and there are no objects showing the 60s architecture, that design objects have never been collected in Lithuania. So what we actually came up with, for instance, the image which is on the top, just shows the way of how we thought we could use object manuals instead of objects themselves. Hanging above a plan of an apartment or of a public space, because, some of the plans could be reconstructed from magazines, from scarce archives that exist. Or below, this is actually the interior of the National Gallery, but, the architects and the curators were fantasizing about the possibility of using shadow silhouettes for reconstructing, sort of the grid type or different type of architecture that was either demolished in the beginning of the 1990s or, just deteriorated, by itself, as some examples in the Beton show also, speak about
it. But doing those kinds of projects, is this part of the state policy, educational purposes of the country to, you call it dematerializing or looking back into what happened in the Cold War time? Knowing Lithuania a little bit, it's I know that that Russian as a language got almost completely erased by people under 30 don't speak Russian anymore. It was the most common spoken language for many, many years. How do
Well,
you...
as a foreign language.
I know it's a foreign language, but it was part of what was, you know, in Soviet times. It was that and art production or education, everything in the arts field in the Soviet times must have had something to do with the language, or not?
Well, it did.
No?
When I studied art history at the Art Academy, and we still have art history at the Art Academy in Vilnius, our main discourse came from Russian art history, because these were the main books that we were trained on. So, I mean, the break that we had from the Russian discourse to mainly the English discourse, you know, it was quite major. But to come back to your question about the state policy and its relations to rethinking the Soviet period, or the Cold War period, if you wish, I think it's a complex issue, it's a complicated issue. On the subjective level, one has to remember that people who were born still in the Soviet times, as myself, many of them are still now in politics. So they carry their, let's say, memories from the Soviet period with themselves, and of course they affect their thinking of contemporary. You know, on the other hand, in the official rhetoric or rhetorics, the dismissal of the Soviet period is, well, radical. It's complete. Nobody wants to think about that. So what the National Gallery of Art actually did in these recent couple of years, we kind of came back to that issue of memory of the Soviet period, really deconstructing certain myths which we think are important for, well, the understanding of today. I have to say that we have worked on several retrospective exhibitions on figures of artists that were considered, let's say, nonconformist or alternative artists. They were recognized as such already from the 1990s, but we wanted to somehow rethink it as a more complex problem. Not that some artists were official and were completely conformist and the other artists were non-official or non-conformist, because it never existed like that. It never existed like that. So we tried to see what kind of different agency might be followed in that non-conformist, you know, attitude, and what actually falls into the trap of conformists. So seeing things together. I can tell you as an example, when we made one of these exhibitions following the work of a sculptor who during the late 60s and 70s, you know, became a legendary alternative artist who was following his individual line completely. In the exhibition, we opened up a completely unknown sphere of his work, which was related to Moscow commissions, the Soviet commissions for world expos to design various sculptural decorations in world expos in Montreal, in Osaka in late 60s and late 70s, which kind of complicated the story about the artist. And complicated both, you know, in the sense that you know, it brought to light the fact that the artist still had to live on something. He couldn't withdraw from, you know, the public life, because having no job in the Soviet period meant that you were threatened to get to jail, because you couldn't live without having any job, you know. So we just wanted to sort of open these issues and say that certain things that happened at the Soviet time have to be revisited to understand the complexity of the art life and the choices that the artists had to make.
Is this period of the Soviet times or Cold War times fully documented on the web, on your website, or not?
No. No, it's not. I mean, because the narratives that are on our website were our initial narratives that we suggested in 2009, before we started our exhibitions, program, and before we started, something which we also call education in the expanded sense, because we do work with education, not only as retelling, reiterating narratives that are in our collection, hang, but also work with various groups of people, occasionally randomly formed, sometimes suggested by our partners. Like at the moment, we are working on the project with homeless people, and that's coming in, in autumn. So it's our education curators and curators who are trying, to figure out how the museum could be, a place that would involve people who do not have their home, people who do not have their homes needs also as a public space in one or another way. So as we haven't started our programs, which I mentioned, the website still doesn't have fully the results of these rethinking and the ideas that we came up with. Unfortunately, not yet. But maybe they shouldn't be there because, then we keep them to ourselves and we have, more time to sort of rest on them and develop them.
But it's such a large part of the country's history. Well, this is why, how you are also associate professor at the Academy for Fine Arts in Vilnius. You teach young people. How do they deal with their history, country's history, because they have all parents who are, still know about the Soviet times. Does for them contemporary life or his art history only start in 1990?
I can tell you like that, because I work both with art history students and with art students in the Art Academy with a few courses that I teach there. What I'm talking about with you actually is very much reflected in their interests. There suddenly has almost the interest towards the interwar period, the period of building the nation state and the national identity. So the interest towards that period has massively decreased. Both in, let's say, art historians' choice of topics which they research, and in artists who are writing their theoretical essays or sort of directing their, eyes towards various contexts. What interests them is contemporary art. We do work in the gallery also with contemporary artists. I was just showing something from the Soviet period and the Soviet period. So these are the two priorities. Let's say the modernity, it probably has some sort of ghost of modernity hovering not only, above the former Soviet Union and the socialist countries, but all around Europe, as Claire Bishop was talking about this modernity, the excess of modernity images. But these two periods and the relations between them is something that young artists and young art historians are definitely more interested in. And generally, I would say more in the complexities of the history. Lithuania has, long and in the end complicated history of the Jewish community living in it. So this is also an issue which, at least from the theoretical point of view, is gaining more and more interest. And I remember, was probably 5 years ago, I was addressed by a German PhD student who was asking me, to provide the list of artworks, contemporary artworks produced in Lithuania on this subject, on the history of, the Jewish community in Lithuania and probably on the Holocaust. Unfortunately, I would come up at that time with one, which was Deimantas Narkevičius, one film that he made on that topic. So there's some hesitation, but also a growing interest in these more complex, let's say, things which have been deleted from the memory and from the urgency, let's say, especially during the Soviet period and the first years in the 1990s.
When I look into the younger art scene of Lithuania and just visiting the Berlin Biennial, there were not a lot of artists from that region. What do people produce? What do artists produce, young artists, students, or the first generation after they left university? And where do they get their information from? What is their interest?
Oh, that's the fast internet.
No, but do they, when you're living, I don't want to use the term periphery, but it's definitely not so easy to travel to and to travel abroad from Lithuania for young people especially.
No, I don't think you are right, Nicolaus.
Okay.
I mean, when I spoke about speaking from the periphery as a privilege, I rather had in mind, the museums and the work that they do, because you really are privileged to discover new things, absolutely new things, new artists, new contexts, rather more complex attitudes to various things than you can do that living, in Paris, in New York, or in London, which, kind of has a more common ground for both thinking and the set of artists in contemporary art or anywhere. But when you work in the museum, and in particular in the museum, I would say, of modern and contemporary art in a smaller country, you kind of feel as a curator, more or less as a contemporary artist, when you are discovering certain, things that were unknown. So that is definitely a privilege. And in terms of contemporary artists, in Lithuania they travel widely and a lot, with all the cheap airlines that came into Lithuania as everywhere else. And I might be wrong, but to my knowledge, the main points where Lithuanian artists usually go is the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, for study, and then also for, living and for collaborating with other people. So there's definitely no lack of, shortage of information.
No, it was not about shortage of information, but I just was surprised that there was a time when artists from the Baltic region were very, very present, especially in Europe, everywhere. So, and this shrunk a little bit.
Well, it definitely shrunk, but this was, during the 1990s, the focus on Eastern Europe was, just happening as, I don't know how to put it. There was definitely a curiosity from the neighbors that we always had in the Western Europe, or it depends on where you are looking from, of course. But it was the time when the discoveries of new peripheries, but in that sense was really not about looking for the new, but rather looking for something that is as if European, but looks slightly different. I always used to say that, seeing the dystopian views of contemporary times, of modernity in East and Central Europe, in Asian countries and everywhere, was sort of just confirming the utopia that was developed in the West in the times of modernity. So then this curiosity and the interest in these dystopias of course vanished, because that transit period or transition period of Eastern European countries brought them to a completely different condition. So there's nothing, that we can sell to the gaze of the Westerner anymore, luckily.
But the advantage yeah, the National Gallery is definitely one of the very rare examples of a national gallery which got founded in the digital age. Where I'm thinking about you as a policymaker, making policy for the politicians as well, and also for the future funding process. How, what are your plans, or what is the policy of your museum to looking into the future?
Meaning in relation to the digital?
In the digital age, in relation to, it's both. I think it goes, and I think this is an advantage. If you really look into the MUMOC is not a national museum. Of course, it's one of the national museums, but it's not the National Gallery. It's funded by the national. But it's not the national. No, but it's interesting. It's not a national. It's a Bundesmuseum, but it's not the National Gallery only. Yeah, it's part of one of the but it's not founded in the digital area. And for them, it's very, for all of them, for your museum, it goes hand in hand in a way. Where do you go? Where do you want to be in 20 years?
I don't know about the 20 years, really. Who can think about 20 years in this speedy age, I would say. I think that what we are going to do, or as much as I'm thinking about it as a chief curator, is trying to really not fall into the trap of obligatory digitalization without a clear policy. Because, without a clear policy, I consider that to be a waste of money. The example of digitalizing the Soros archives a little bit too early kind of holds me back, because I understand that technologies are running, ahead in a very fast pace, and then you probably digitalize a lot of what we have in the archives and in the storages, and then nobody can see that because the format changes. I still think that one has really to understand why this is done. What we are actually doing quite a lot in the National Gallery in relation to that, and there's also a small slide, I think, here. We are actually thinking about images and what images mean and what images do to our imagination. So this is one of the examples of the exhibitions that we made, was called A Place of Images. The National Gallery has done quite a few exhibitions of photography, mainly Lithuanian photography, but also, international artists, as we have now the photography exhibition of the Israeli photographer Sharon Yari. So we did that because photography was one of the mediums that was kind of also marginalized up to the mid-90s, I have to say, and that we were trying to, discover what was in that photography. But together with that, we also started initiating discussion about what an image actually is. So with one of the photography exhibitions, we made this one, which actually deconstructed the role of the image independence to its content, because we showed same images of Lithuanian photographers which were being used for ideological purposes in widespread press, and then they kind of got another constructed meaning, Then they were shown in exhibitions which were oftentimes even not, very official exhibitions, because photography was not shown in, for instance, the Exhibitions Palace, which is at the moment the Contemporary Art Center, but only shown in its own places. And then we showed the same images as they are now being reproduced in big fancy photography books that present these photographers as major figures. And in every case, depending on the context of placing the image, the meaning always sort of ruptured. There was always a rupture in between these different meanings that got in the context. So speaking about images, speaking about what role images play and how important the contexts are for articulating this image is something which we, I think, are going to continue together with the whole digitalizing boom that is just going by itself.
Thank you very much. Now we have time for 2 questions, if there are any. Yes, Dieter. Roelstraten.
Well, tying it back to the question that Nicolaus asked in conclusion about the future of the museum, or the road ahead, the first image you showed, the just kind of the Google image search result of the National Gallery, or no, sorry, Lithuanian Contemporary Art.
Which one?
Yeah, well, yes, this image, yes. So the future of the museum also has to take into account the coming of this new museum.
Excuse me, can you repeat?
The Daniel Libeskind Museum.
Yes, so there's a new
Daniel
museum.
Libeskind Museum.
There's a new museum on the horizon, and so I'm curious about this new museum. It's a privately funded museum, so there's money in Vilnius for art of that kind, local oligarchs, or what's going to be in there? Is it going to be an empty box?
Yeah, it's actually.
Will it only have virtual exhibitions?
It's a very good question to continue actually what I was telling about. Yes, this is a museum which is funded by a family, by 2 private collectors. And they started buying only Lithuanian artworks, of artists who started working in the 1960s. And they are definitely building another national collection, which is actually interesting. They started it not so long ago, but we are buying quite extensively. In the beginning, artworks of the artists from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and now they are expanding their collection into 90s and contemporary art. They had the privilege and the possibility to acquire Lithuanian contemporary artworks, quite on a wide scale, which the National Art Gallery couldn't do, because starting from 2008, when the crisis hit, up to this year, there was no funding for acquisitions of contemporary art in Lithuania. So, interestingly, for this completely national collection that they acquired, they invited an architect who, is building museums all around the world, to build an iconic building in the center of Vilnius, sort of a global moment, which would uphold a very local collection. But to follow your question about the digital, space, they do have a very well, let's say, their collection is very well presented online. It's called the Modern Art Center. Not the contemporary, but the Modern Art Center, and they have a website which introduces probably 100% of their collection, and they commissioned a new narrative, or the new history of Lithuanian art from 1960s onwards to several art historians, which is also being written. At the moment, it's only in Lithuanian, but it's going to be translated into English. So the private collection, and not only this one, there are 2 other collections in Lithuania, but this is the only one which is now building the museum. They are much better presented on the web than the national institutions, or let's say the state institutions, because if one looked into the website of the CAC, the Contemporary Art Center of Vilnius, this would look more as information space or the working space for the basic information, rather than a virtual museum or the virtual exhibition. Does that answer your question, or was something else that you wanted to know?
Yes.
When will this open? Well, I spoke quite recently with the management of them. They plan it for 2019, but we are speaking in 2016, they haven't started. Well, for you and maybe for the audience online, it might be interesting that the museum is coming up exactly on the side of the former Cinema Lietuva, which was the site for the project of Gediminas and Nomeda Urbonas, the protest laboratory. So after all these arguments, also court cases, it's now a private collection in the shell of the Dalia Libeskind architecture coming up.
And it's a private collection based in Lithuania?
Yes, it is a private collection based in Lithuania,
Okay.
You know, with, you know, really hundreds of works in that of both the Soviet period and contemporary artists.
Thank you very much, Lolita.
Thank you.
So.